I want to tell you about the most dangerous financial moment I have ever personally experienced. And it was not a market crash, it was not a job loss, it was not a bad investment or an unexpected expense or any of the dramatic things that show up in financial cautionary tales. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I opened my investment app and saw a number with 6 digits in front of the decimal point for the very first time. $100,000, my own money, invested, working, growing. And the feeling I had in that moment was not what I expected. I expected the same quiet relief I felt when I hit $10,000 in savings. I expected a sense of arrival. Instead, what I felt, underneath the genuine satisfaction, was something I did not have a name for at the time, but that I now recognize very clearly. I felt like I could relax. Not completely, not dramatically, just a little. Just enough to stop pressing quite as hard, just enough to start treating the discipline that had gotten me there as something I could ease up on now that I had arrived somewhere real, just enough to start making small exceptions that individually seemed completely harmless. And that feeling, that specific quiet sense that the hard part is behind you and you can finally breathe, is the most financially dangerous feeling I have ever experienced. Because I now understand exactly what it costs in compounding terms when you act on it, and the number is staggering. Today I want to walk you through the part of the wealth-building journey that almost nobody talks about honestly, not because it is complicated, but because it is boring. And boring things do not get clicks and do not generate excitement and do not feel urgent enough to take seriously until you see the math of what the boring phase actually contains. Getting your first $100,000 is mathematically the hardest part of building wealth. Everyone who has done it knows that is true, and I am going to show you exactly why in just a minute. But getting from $100,000 to $650,000 is the most dangerous part, not because the math gets harder, because the psychology gets worse, because you are in Death Valley, far enough from the start that the early urgency has faded, far enough from the destination that the finish line does not feel motivating yet, just grinding through the middle with no dramatic milestones and no obvious reason to maintain the intensity that got you here. This video is about surviving that phase without sabotaging the compound interest that is quietly doing more work for you during this period than it has ever done before or will ever do again in your wealth-building journey. Subscribe right now if you are new here. Let's get into it. I want to start with the math because I think once you see these specific numbers clearly, everything else in this video will make more sense and feel more urgent than it otherwise would. Let's say you are investing $1,000 per month into a low-cost S&P 500 index fund earning an average annual return of 8%. These are round numbers designed to illustrate the principle. Your actual numbers will be different, but the relationship between the numbers is what matters. At that rate, here is roughly how long each milestone takes to reach. Getting from $0 to $100,000 takes approximately 7.5 to 8 years. 7.5 years of consistent monthly contributions before you clear 6 figures. I remember this phase personally, and I want to be honest about what it feels like. It feels slow. The early years especially feel like you are barely moving. Your $1,000 monthly contribution in year 1 is larger than the interest your portfolio generates. You are doing all the work and the compounding engine is just warming up. Progress is real, but it does not feel dramatic because it is not dramatic yet. Getting from $100,000 to $200,000 takes approximately 4.5 to 5 years. You just cut the time to add $100,000 nearly in half, not because you did anything differently, because the $100,000 that is already invested is now generating returns that contribute meaningfully alongside your monthly contributions. The engine is running. Getting from $200,000 to $400,000 takes approximately another 5 years. You just doubled your portfolio in the same time it previously took you to add $100,000. The math is accelerating visibly now. And here is the number I want you to hold on to because I think it is the most motivating single data point in personal finance. Once you have $650,000 invested at 8% annual returns, the portfolio generates approximately $52,000 per year in returns. That is $52,000 added to your net worth in a year from growth alone, without you contributing a single additional dollar. Your portfolio at that point is generating close to the median American household income just by existing and compounding. The journey from $0 to $100,000 took you nearly 8 years of hard, disciplined, consistent work. The journey from $100,000 to $650,000 takes roughly another 10 to 12 years of continued consistency. And the destination on the other side of that 10 to 12 years is a portfolio that generates meaningful income purely through compound growth every single year for the rest of your life. I find this math genuinely awe-inspiring every time I work through it, and I also find it genuinely sobering because of what it reveals about the cost of easing up during Death Valley. Here is what I mean specifically. Let us say you hit $100,000 and that quiet sense of relaxation I described at the start of this video causes you to drop your monthly contribution from $1,000 to $600. Not to zero, not a dramatic change, just a 40% reduction because you feel like you have earned a little more breathing room and your lifestyle has expanded a bit and the urgency has faded somewhat. That 40% reduction in monthly contribution during the Death Valley phase does not produce a 40% reduction in your eventual outcome. Because of how compounding works, the reduction in contributions during the highest leverage phase of your journey produces a disproportionately large reduction in your final number. The difference between contributing $1,000 per month and $600 per month during Death Valley can easily be $300,000 to $400,000 in final portfolio value. A $400 monthly reduction in contributions produces a potential $400,000 reduction in long-term wealth. That ratio should genuinely alarm you. It alarmed me when I first calculated it for my own situation. Now I want to explain the psychology of why Death Valley is so dangerous, because understanding the mechanism is what allows you to defend against it. The first psychological trap is what I call milestone amnesia. When you are grinding toward $10,000 in savings, the goal is clear and proximate. You can see it coming. The progress is fast relative to the distance. When you hit it, the accomplishment is fresh and motivating, and the memory of how hard you worked for it is vivid. But $100,000 takes 7 to 8 years. By the time you get there, the specific sacrifices and decisions of the early years are not vivid anymore. They are just the background texture of how you have lived for nearly a decade. And when you hit the milestone, instead of feeling the sharp contrast between before and after, you feel a kind of ambient satisfaction. You feel like you have always been someone who is reasonably good with money. The memory of the discipline gets absorbed into your identity in a way that makes it feel less like an active effort and more like a passive characteristic. And passive characteristics are much easier to quietly abandon than active efforts. When you know you are working hard at something, you know when you stop working hard at it. When you think of financial discipline as just part of who you are, you can gradually let it erode without ever making a conscious decision to do so. The second psychological trap is horizon blindness. Death Valley is the phase where the destination feels genuinely abstract. You have $100,000 or $150,000 or $200,000 invested. The $650,000 milestone that represents meaningful financial freedom is still many years away. The S&P 500 fluctuates. There are recessions and recoveries and periods where the market goes sideways for a year, and your balance barely moves despite consistent contributions. During those flat or down periods, the human brain does something very specific. It recalculates the distance to the goal and finds it discouraging. It looks at the gap between where it is and where it is going, and it makes a completely irrational but emotionally compelling calculation. That calculation is approximately this. I have been doing this for years, and I am still so far from the destination that my individual contributions barely seem to matter. Maybe I will just take a break. Maybe I will redirect some of this money towards something more immediately satisfying. Maybe the long-term math works out fine even if I ease up for a while. This thought pattern is the Death Valley killer, and it is so compelling during the flat periods because it feels like a reasonable response to discouraging data rather than what it actually is, which is the single most expensive financial mistake available to someone in the middle of their wealth-building journey. I want to give you the specific mental framework I use to counteract this, because I think abstract warnings about psychological traps are less useful than a concrete tool you can actually apply. I call it decoupling progress from balance. The insight behind it is simple. During Death Valley, your portfolio balance is a terrible measure of your progress because it is subject to market volatility that has nothing to do with your behavior. In a down market year, your balance might be lower at the end of the year than it was at the beginning despite 12 months of consistent contributions. If your measure of progress is your balance, that year will feel like failure. And feeling like failure during a year where you did everything right is a recipe for actually starting to fail. The measure I use instead is contribution consistency. Did I make my automated contribution every single month? Yes or no? That is the only progress metric that is entirely within my control and entirely immune to market noise. A year where the market dropped 15%, but I maintained every single contribution is a year where I bought shares at a 15% discount compared to what they cost the year before. That is a good year by the metric that actually matters, even though the balance number tells a story that feels discouraging. I track my contribution consistency the way I imagine an athlete tracks training sessions. The score for each month is binary. Did I do it or did I not? Market conditions are irrelevant to the score. Life circumstances are irrelevant to the score. The score is one thing and one thing only, consistent or not. This framework removes the emotional volatility from the behavior. And removing the emotional volatility from the behavior is the single most important thing you can do during Death Valley, because emotional volatility in investing almost always manifests as behavioral errors that cost real money. I want to address one more Death Valley trap specifically because I think it is the one that catches the most financially literate people, people who understand the math and believe in the strategy and are genuinely committed to the long-term plan. I call it the sophistication trap. It works like this. You have been consistently investing in low-cost index funds for 6 or 7 years. You have real money accumulated. You have developed real financial knowledge over that period. And you start to feel like the simple, boring strategy you started with is beneath your current level of sophistication. You have learned a lot. You are not the beginner who needed to just buy an index fund and leave it alone anymore. You understand valuations and sectors and macroeconomic cycles. Surely you can do better now than just owning the whole market. So you start allocating portions of your portfolio to individual stocks you have conviction in, or to alternative assets, or to more complex strategies that feel more commensurate with your current level of knowledge and the significance of the capital you have accumulated. Sometimes this works out fine, occasionally it works out very well. But the research on this pattern is extremely consistent, and it is not kind to the sophisticated investor who departs from simplicity. The vast majority of individual investors, including highly educated and financially knowledgeable ones, underperform simple index fund strategies over long time horizons, not because they are making obviously bad decisions. Because they are introducing complexity and the associated transaction costs, tax drag, and behavioral vulnerability that complexity creates. The boring strategy is boring because it works. Complexity is interesting because it feels like it should work better. Those are very different standards, and conflating them is expensive. I personally keep a very small portion of my portfolio, genuinely small, for what I call conviction positions. Individual bets where I have done real research and I have genuine thesis-driven conviction. Everything else stays in the boring low-cost index fund exactly where it has always been. The conviction portion satisfies the part of my brain that wants to engage actively with markets without putting the core compounding engine at risk. That boundary is not about distrust of my own judgment. It is about honest acknowledgement that the Death Valley phase is not the time to introduce behavioral risk into the strategy that is quietly doing the most important work of my financial life. Let me give you the 3 specific things I want you to do or think about this week, depending on where you are in the journey. If you're still working toward $100,000, the most important thing I can tell you is this: the momentum you are building right now is more valuable than it looks. The compounding engine is warming up even though it does not feel like it yet. Every month of consistency during this phase is building the behavioral foundation that Death Valley will test later. Keep going. The math rewards you disproportionately for the patience you're building right now. If you are somewhere inside Death Valley, somewhere between $100,000 and $650,000, I want you to do one specific thing this week. Open your investment account and look at how much your portfolio generated in returns last year purely from growth, separate from your contributions. Add that number to your annual contribution amount. Look at the combined total. That combined total is the actual annual progress your wealth building system is generating. I suspect it is larger than you have been giving yourself credit for. The compounding is working, it is just quiet. If you're approaching or have passed $650,000, I genuinely want to acknowledge something directly. You survived Death Valley. You did the boring thing for the boring years when the boring thing was the hardest thing. The portfolio that is now generating meaningful annual returns on its own exists because of the consistency you maintained during the phase when consistency was most expensive psychologically. That is not a small thing. That is the actual work. The Death Valley of wealth building is not exciting. It was never going to be exciting. It is the decade-long middle section of a journey whose most dramatic rewards come at the end. The people who arrive at the other end are not the ones who found a way to make it exciting. They are the ones who found a way to keep going when it was boring, who treated the monthly contribution as non-negotiable when nothing around them was reinforcing the decision, who left the compound interest alone when every interesting alternative was whispering that surely there was a faster way. There is no faster way. There is only the consistent way, protected from the psychological forces that turn boring phases into expensive detours. The math is on your side, trust it enough to stay out of its way. Hit subscribe if you want to keep working through this kind of thing with me every week. Share this with someone you know who is somewhere in Death Valley right now and might need to hear that the boring is working even when it does not feel like it. This is Dave. I will see you in the next one.